Great. It's already quiet. So. Good evening, everyone. My name's Mark Maloney, and I'm the Vice Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs. And it's my privilege and an honor to welcome you this evening to tonight's event entitled Russia and the War. The title obviously gives away the theme. What's important to note is although this is the first event that we've held this academic year related to the ongoing war in Ukraine, it's the eighth, at least, event that we've organized by PSIA since the war began last February, including, in fact, a historic exchange between French university students, including those from Sciences Po, and Ukraine's President Zelensky, who joined us live from Kiev in this very theater on the 11th of May. So we're very pleased to add to this series of events related to the war in Ukraine. Each one of these events has proven extremely interesting and rich, as I'm sure will be the case this evening as well. Dear Vladimir Milov, on behalf of Sciences Po and the Paris School of International Affairs, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this prestigious Emil Boutmy Amphitheater, which is named after the founder of Sciences Po 150 years ago. We're celebrating our 150th anniversary this year. We're honored and delighted to have you with us. I'll shortly ask Professor Mendras to introduce today's event and our guest of honor more fully. For those who don't know, Marie Mendras is a renowned specialist in Russia and post-Soviet studies. She's a professor at Sciences Po, where she teaches at PSIA, and as well as other places, but we're very proud of the fact that she teaches with us at PSIA. She's also a research fellow with the CNRS based at the CERI, the Center for International Relations Studies, and has a long and distinguished record of publications. She's a member of the EU-Russia Centre in Brussels, and she's an associate fellow with the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in London. Dear Marie, thank you so much for making this evening's event possible. Let me now hand over to you as chair for this rich and inspiring talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. And I must say that the support of PSIA and Sciences Po as a university has been really fantastic. I think for us as scholars, researchers, for our students, and in particular our students from Ukraine and Russia, the constant support of our institution just has helped us go through this and continue, because it will continue for certainly still a few more months. Thank you very much. I mean, really, that we could organize Vladimir Milov's conference in such a short time, and thank you, all of you, for being here. It is an ominous day. It's what's been happening since last night in Moscow to, be speaking of the war. So I'm sure that Vladimir Milov will address the question of this mobilization and this presidential ukaz, or he will choose to do this when you ask him the question. But what makes it also a very bright evening is that you are here. Vladimir, now you live in Vilnius, because you had to leave Russia in the spring of 2021. It was becoming too dangerous for you and your family, and I would say the leading members of Alexey Navalny's team now live and work very actively in Vilnius, also in other places, but the headquarters now is in Vilnius. Vladimir Milov is a leading figure of the democratic opposition in Russia, and he's been for many years. He is also now vice president of the Free Russia Foundation that does formidable work with the Russians, both in Russia and outside Russia, and also keep producing great reports about what's happening in Russia, and of course about the war in Ukraine as well. Vladimir was born in Kemerovo, Siberia, and he graduated from the Moscow State Mining University in the mid-1990s. And he very rapidly worked for the government and government institutions. In 1997 until 2001, early 2001, he worked for the Federal Energy Commission of Russia, which is really a regulator of electricity and gas resources. And in 2002, for a few months, Vladimir Milov served as Vice Minister of Energy, Deputy Minister of Energy. He left in October 2002, because he strongly disagreed with Putin's and his government policies, in particular regarding Gazprom. Then he ran the Institute for Energy Policy in Moscow. That's where we met almost 20 years ago. And he became very active also in political life, and he led the Democratic Choice Party in the years 2000. One important moment also of his political career is that he was a close friend and ally of Boris Nemtsov, who was Deputy Prime Minister of Yeltsin in the 1990s and a leading opposition figure, and was killed in February 2015 on the bridge that leads to the Kremlin. And so in 2009, Boris Nemtsov decided to run for the post of mayor of Sochi. You see where Sochi is? Not very far from Ukraine and Crimea, where there were Olympic Games. And Nemtsov was born in Sochi, so he was very popular in Sochi. And Vladimir spent weeks there campaigning with him in Sochi. Of course, after fraud, he didn't win the post. Vladimir has been writing many excellent reports. Most famous that he wrote with Nemtsov was published in 2008-09, Putin Itogi, Putin the Results, and it was really the first key report about the corruption of Putin and the Putin ruling circles and a big monopoly system. And there are a number of other reports you can see online. Some he has published with the Martens Centre in Brussels, but also I urge all of you to watch his series of historical videos on YouTube. It's Vladimir Milov YouTube, and he goes extensively into the years the 1990s and the 2000s. He is a very good energy expert, so he can also answer your questions. And I remember that the first time we met, and then we invited you to Sciences Po in 2005, and you gave a paper here at a conference on Russian foreign policy. So it's we're glad that you came to Sciences Po early in your career of expert on energy and political leader. So those questions, of course, can be addressed in the questions, but I have asked Vladimir to analyze for us the war and try and tell us how it looks from Russia, from the Russian point of view, whether those Russians live in Russia or outside Russia. So it's both the ruling circles and Putin, but also all the elites and middle class that are leaving and those that are staying, and just the Russians, the average Russian, how they see the situation and what may happen next. Vladimir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marie, and good evening, everybody. It's a privilege being here, although at very difficult times. I wish I could have said I'm happy, but there's little room for happiness on the background of the barbarity that Putin is currently doing in Ukraine. And a lot of us really take this very personally because we have a long story of sympathy and affection for Ukraine and Ukrainian people. We just recall today the days of August 91 when brave Russians managed to overthrow the communist attempt to establish a dictatorship, the communist coup d'etat, and we were there at the square near the White House carrying Ukrainian flags. We very much welcomed the aspirations of Ukrainian people for freedom, which was true over the years. Marie mentioned Boris Nemtsov. Boris was the key organizer of really mass rallies that took place in Moscow after the annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass. March Mira, the March for Peace, that happened 2 times, in spring and later in autumn. Several dozen thousands of people bravely marching through the streets of Moscow with Ukrainian flags. And Boris planned more. He was not allowed to do this because he was assassinated. And we now understand that all this brutal crackdown against the Russian opposition and attempt to murder Navalny and later his imprisonment, this was directly connected with Putin's desire to shut down the potentially very strong anti-war movement in the course of preparation for invading Ukraine. He didn't want major opposition voices to organize people to go and protest against his invasion. So he did a preemptive operation when a lot of my friends and colleagues were either murdered or imprisoned or criminal investigations were opened, so many people were forced to flee. And so what's happening is really hard to watch for us, and particularly it is hard because after Putin's invasion, we have learned about the big numbers of the Russian people who are aggressively supporting what Putin is doing. And this is, many of you know that this is a personal tragedy for many families, many young Russians, because their relatives, their acquaintances, a lot of them repeat this crazy stuff that they hear from television about the genocide that Ukraine committed in Donbass, about the threat of NATO to Russia, all that imperialistic crap that Russians are being fed with every day from Putin's television. However, that's not the end of story, because I'm here to say and discuss a different Russia, totally different Russia, which is luckily still alive, no matter of the Putin's unprecedented extreme repressions. I always keep repeating that the scale of repressions is something probably unseen in my country since 1950s. Because I lived through the times of Brezhnev and Andropov, and back then only several hundreds of Soviet dissidents were under pressure, were imprisoned or sent to psychiatry in a mandatory way. Most of us, the atmosphere back then in late Soviet times was much freer than today. Nobody went across tens of thousands of households knocking on doors and warning people against speaking up against the government, which is what the police does in Russia on a daily basis. We spoke relatively freely in kitchens, in schools, in workplaces that many people are not happy with the Soviet government and its policies. That was all out in the open. This is actually why later perestroika started. Not now. People are extremely afraid that somebody will snitch on them, report to the police or FSB, and they will be knocking on his door either. This is why you don't see many people speaking up against the war, although there are significant numbers in these circumstances, but many prefer to stay silent because they're simply afraid. They're squeezed between a prospect of getting 15 years of imprisonment for being part of Navalny's extremist network, or getting 15 years in prison for what they call distributing fakes about the activities of Russian army, or simply telling the truth about Putin's aggression. So this is the Russian daily menu right now. Choose for which article you want to sit 15 years in jail. So I think it's not really fair to criticize many people who are against Putin, against the war, and are still in Russia. They're afraid for themselves, afraid for their families. But we know that many, actually millions of them, are desperately looking for a way out of this barbaric situation. We still continue to be committed to broadcast and communicate with the Russian people through social media. We're lucky that it's 21st century, and unlike Soviet dissident exiles, we really have means for daily communication with Russians, and our audiences are fairly big. At peak in March this year, after the war broke out, the monthly audience of Navalny Live YouTube channel was over 20 million unique viewers, great majority of them from Russia. It has receded a bit since then, but still the numbers are fairly high. We're talking about dozens of millions of people who watch alternative channels and sources of information which counter state propaganda, watch them on social media and on YouTube. That is encouraging. Russian polling data, obviously, in these current totalitarian conditions is tricky. But if you look, for instance, at less politicized questions, like what advertisers are doing, they're doing research about what media sources are popular in the country this moment, not asking this head-on, straightforward question, do you support Vladimir Vladimirovich policies or not? Answer right now. But if people are asked the question, what kind of media sources they're watching, whom do they trust, one of the really encouraging trends is that trust in government media and state propaganda has plunged to historic lows. I'm sure many of you saw that. A recent data by Ramir Levada Group M suggests that it's just within the 25–30% range of respondents that Russians say that they do trust social media and state TV, and primarily this happens in the elderly age group, 55 plus. When you go further towards the younger generation, they completely disregard television and state propaganda. This is encouraging. It means that despite all the repression, there is the totally different, the other Russia which exists, which is still alive, and which despises the war and fully rejects Putin's aggression. During my YouTube streams, I ask my viewers to constantly send me the pictures of anti-war graffiti which they spot on the streets. And I do not regret it that I asked, but it's very difficult because when you open your messengers, it's just blowing up like everywhere from Baltiysk to Khanty-Mansiysk to Khabarovsk. It's across the country. And as a matter of fact, many people use it as a sign that they're not alone. When they see the walk towards the schools, their jobs, and they they see this anti-war graffiti, anti-war signs, they smile because they understand that it's not just them alone against a bunch of relatives who watch too much TV, but there are many other people who are there and speaking out against the war. There's obvious question, which we also discussed today, why Russians are not protesting the war on a significant scale. Well, I think it's really important to appreciate what happens with the Russian society at the moment, what scale of everyday pressure is applied towards people who dare to openly say even something, not to mention going out protesting on the streets. You know the stories, I'm sure you heard about it, when facial recognition system in the Russian underground is being used in Moscow to catch and detain activists who were spotted previously in the protest rallies, which is a message from a big brother, Chinese Communist Party style, like, we know who you are and where you are, we will catch you on your way to work or university. People are very scared. Looking at what happened to Navalny, what happened to Ilya Yashin and other colleagues who are behind bars now, many ask themselves a question like, what can we do? Can we alone change anything if the most prominent leaders of the opposition are either imprisoned or in exile? So at the moment, I think we really got to appreciate that, yes, people are brave enough to be against the war, but maybe this is not the right moment to really expect them to sacrifice themselves protesting on the street. Because Putin's government has many ways to destroy their lives forever. We have experience of activists who serve prison terms under Bolotnaya case, under Moscow case. Many of them, after spending time in Putin's prison, actually dropped further political activism because it's really very hard. And I strongly encourage many people who discuss this to appreciate that, because I spent myself in total 32 days behind bars. And I can tell you that before you experience this yourself, you really should not try to engage in this conversation about why Russians are not protesting. They will. They will. This anger, this protest movement is brewing. At some point in time, we saw it in 1980s, and we also, I touched upon this earlier today, in 1984, when we had last controlled Soviet elections under Konstantin Chernenko, then General Secretary of the Communist Party, and it was like a classic Soviet result of 99.99% for KPSS. We couldn't have imagined in our wildest dreams that in 3 or 4 years' time, we will be out on the streets with slogans, down with KPSS. But it happened. Once the system began to weaken, once more and more people broadly in the society and in the ruling nomenclature begin questioning Communist Party's policies, people started to lose this fear, to shrug it off, and went onto the streets. I'm pretty sure there will be a moment when this happens this time around. And no wonder that Putin is really tightening the screws to the max with the Stalinist-type repressions, no less, with going after against tens of thousands of people who receive warnings, threats. Many of them are intimidated, some arrested or fined, and so on. This mass pressure is applied for a purpose, because Putin is absolutely unsure about his widespread support that you read about in the media, which fails to interpret the polling data correctly. If there would have been such a widespread and solid support, there will be no repression like that. Putin will not be afraid of anybody challenging his policies. There will be no attempts to shut down even like the smallest regional online media outlets who speak in a pretty vegetarian style about what happens with Putin's aggression against Ukraine. If Putin was so sure about his overwhelming support, as some of the Western media would report, then he wouldn't try to silence all, even the smallest dissenting voices. Many other encouraging signs is that, first, you don't see any serious bottom-up movement in support of Putin or his war. When some of the hardcore imperialist pro-Putin's organizations call for independent street rallies, like Starikov's Fatherland or Fyodorov's Nod, they gather like 100, 200 people maximum. There are no mass rallies in support of Putin which are not staged. Everything that happens is done with a centralized effort, mobilization effort by the administrations. You don't see why Putin has called mandatory mobilization today. You know that he hesitated in previous months because it obviously will have repercussions, negative consequences, because mandatory mobilization will not be terribly popular in Russia, to put it very mildly, because there were no volunteers lining up to go and fight in Ukraine, because he had exhausted all other options. He tried what I call a commercial mobilization, when people in the regions, particularly the poorest, less developed regions, were offered a cosmic salaries by their standards, 200,000-300,000 rubles per month. If you live in a region where average salary is 20,000-30,000, just this figure alone would make you crazy. Given also the fact that Russians have lived with decline and stagnation of real wages for the past decade, that many of people, particularly in the poorest regions, are critically dependent on bank loans and they have no money to repay them. So there are millions of Russians on the verge of individual bankruptcy and so on. So when you hear like you are about to be paid 200,000-300,000 rubles per month, some of the people risked, but there were no huge lines and there were not enough personnel mobilized that way, which is why Putin went for mandatory mobilization. So this is also, to me, it looks like an encouraging factor, that in the past 7 months, Putin actually failed to awaken this imperialistic momentum within the Russian society to the extent when Russians are ready to take arms and go fight in Ukraine. No, babble in their family circle after they listen to too much TV, yes. Taking an AK-47 and going to fight in Ukraine, definitely no. This is the result of the past 7 months, it's very clear. I always say that it is very, very unfortunate and extremely saddening that we do have a lot of people in Russian society that actually vocally support what Putin is doing. It's a huge problem for decades to come. We will have to cure that. There will be a very, very difficult effort. But what I keep saying is that this imperialistic, pro-Putin part of the Russian society is also extremely passive in terms of their ability to actually do anything but repeat the stuff that they hear on TV in conversations with their relatives and acquaintances. So my point, to make the long story short, is that despite all these grim circumstances, there is hope. Me and my colleagues, we have a lot of hope for the future of Russia, for its ability to become a normal country, which is focused on its own development and progress, and which is committed to living at peace with everybody else, right? And things like waging imperialist aggressive wars against our neighbors and whoever else will be forbidden forever. There is a future. And we see the signs of this future even in this very dark, very discouraging environment. However, as my friend Roland Freudenstein says, the light is there, but the tunnel is long. We will have to get engaged in a very, very long endeavor to fight such a strong and potent adversary as Putin and his regime. I think that we discussed, I've spent a few days in Paris, met with many politicians, experts, and I'm traveling across the Euro-Atlantic space discussing all these recent developments. I think one big mistake when a lot of people are making is that a lot of them want this thing to be over as soon as possible and sometimes at any cost. Which is why you hear a lot of stuff like, let's force Ukraine into signing some sort of ceasefire agreement to end the war and so on. To which I respond that ceasefire, as we know from Minsk agreements, ceasefire is not an end to the war. In the present circumstances, it's just giving some time for Putin to replenish, regroup, and strike again, which we already saw happening. To end the war would mean to end the very ability of Putin or any other aggressive dictatorships to wage wars against international rule-based democratic order like Putin is doing right now. To end this ability once and for all. That will be a guarantee for peace and stability. And again, this might be a long endeavor, because we need to have no illusions. Putin's system is pretty strong, pretty capable of continuing this thing for quite a long period of time. So point number one, we need not to look at our clock every 5 minutes and say, oh, well, because Putin still hasn't ended the war, that means sanctions are not working, this not working, that not working. You know, I used this metaphor the other day. Like, imagine I'm walking through a rainforest in Amazon, and I meet the anaconda, which tries to strangle me. So what I do is try to strangle her back. Do I ask myself a question, how long will it take and how more time, and maybe I need to release her if 5 minutes already passed and she's still alive? No. I keep doing this thing until it's finished. So I think this should be the approach. And to achieve the victory over Putin and his brutal attempt to redraw not only the borders of Ukraine, but also the international rule-based order, the only recipe here is to apply pressure on all sides. Arming Ukraine, making sure that it's achieving a military victory at the battlefield. Imposing more sanctions and making sure that current sanctions are working better and are fully implemented. Very important effort is broadcasting for the Russians and engaging in people-to-people communication with people who are still in the country to make sure that Putin loses the remains of public support, that the public opinion finally completely turns against him. That will significantly help to bring the end of his regime closer. I don't think it's really worth, I'm pretty sure people will be asking this question of when and how Putin's regime will end and all this nightmare will end. We do not know. I think given all Putin's strengths, we probably should not be asking ourselves this question. We should be committed to continuously apply pressure from all sides. In the battlefields of Ukraine, international pressure with sanctions and isolating Putin regime, turning public opinion in Russia against Putin. Constant pressure on all sides. That's the only recipe. Again, we do not know how and when it will produce a final effect. As Marie mentioned, I'm a mechanical engineer by training. And I can tell you that it's an extremely hard task to diagnose fatigue cracks in a very big, complicated mechanism. Particularly when this mechanism is non-transparent and you are not allowed to monitor what is going on inside. But there is law of physics, after all. Under this, Putin took too much weight onto his shoulders, more than he can handle. So the cracks will appear. What I hear from today's news about mass mobilization, surprisingly as it may sound to some of you, gives me optimism. Because this is this is actually a declaration of defeat. He was not able to achieve his military goals in Ukraine without mass mobilization, which he didn't want to go for. All the previous months, you know, there were rumors that it might happen on the 9th of May or whatever. He sort of was reluctant to do this because it will produce, again, negative consequences in terms of public opinion, and he knows that. But he finally threw out the white flag. He said, there is no other way to mobilize more manpower to go fighting in Ukraine except unwanted, undesired mass mobilization. Many people in Russia would interpret this exactly the same way. Like, listen, he promised, like he's a great leader that can, you know, achieve his goals in 3 days, as Putin's propagandists and pundits have promised when the invasion was launched. 3 days and we take Kiev. Now it's been 7 months and he's calling for help. You remember in the previous years, he sat in his bunker, you know, barely agreeing to meet anyone, not to mention visit some other countries and so on. Now you see him visiting all across countries, all across Asia, Iran, Central Asia, and Ankara further. He became a carpetbagger. We see very unusual sights of Putin sitting and waiting for leaders of other countries to arrive to meet him. Usually it was vice versa. Everybody waited for hours for him. That means there are a lot of signs of mounting trouble. I think we should be encouraged by that, but we also should have no illusions that he's still a very strong adversary, and more pressure on all fronts should be applied to finally make him stop, to inflict these cracks in the regime. Eventually this will happen. Again, I strongly advise against engaging in fruitless discussions about when and how. And if not soon enough, then I do not participate. We all should participate, regardless of how long and how much effort this will take. And only this will ensure Putin's defeat. I'll probably stop here and we'll be happy to answer more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Thank you very much for really putting on the table so many key issues. I would like to ask you a question, and in the meantime, please, if you'd like to ask a question, there are 2 microphones, one on the right, one on the left, and we'll take several questions at a time. Just if you can, please keep them short so we can take as many questions as possible. Vladimir, my question is about the black box, the inner circle, the inner ruling circle, not so much, let's say, the ruling elites, I mean, all the people that are engaged in this war, whether they're civilian, military, intelligence, but really the black box, because we keep saying Putin, and we know that there is this small group of men, and maybe also in the back of our minds when we say we need more sanctions, is we know that that's putting a lot of pressure on everybody in Russia, from professional elites to middle class, but it's also putting pressure on the inner circle. How do you see this group of men functioning? And you mentioned several times, cracks. Do you think there can be cracks at the very center, of the atom?
Yeah. First, I have to say that it's not necessarily wrong to say that too much power is concentrated personally in Putin's hands. A lot of people are asking these questions like, yeah, there is Putin, but we should not limit our analysis to himself. There are also many people around him who are important. There are, But really, Putin has concentrated so much absolutist power in his hands that we should really appreciate that and say it. So the inner circle matters to some extent, but not to the extent that many political analysts are discussing this. Like some of the folks have been using the term Politburo, going back to the Soviet governance analogy. There is no Politburo. If you read declassified Communist Party documents, you will see that Politburo really seriously discussed issues and argued between themselves, sometimes bitterly. Should we invade Afghanistan or should we not? And there were different opinions and they were clashing. Not now. You all saw probably the February's broadcast of the National Security Council. There was one wolf and a lot of sheep who were basically, some of them, I know many of these people personally, actually. I really thought that it really looks like a first grade pupil which have not learned his lesson and is up for capital punishment, not the all-powerful members of the inner circle. So as a matter of fact, there is an inner circle. I would say the structure of this goes top-down from the said National Security Council through FSB, which is the main enforcement instrument of enforcing the actual absolute power in the country. Everywhere you have FSB. FSB, like, no matter what Oleg Tinkov says, he had a deputy from FSB who was supervising all his banking business, like any other more or less significant Russian enterprise has. In Soviet times, we had three competing military and security structures: the army, the Ministry of Interior, and KGB. Not anymore. Since the beginning of Putin's rule, he infiltrated both the army and the general army staff and the Ministry of Interior with deputy ministers, deputy heads, delegated from the FSB. You can all see their bios at the websites. So Putin, through Patrushev and Bortnikov, his key allies from the Security Council, also from FSB, with FSB the main power enforcement mechanism, that's the inner circle. And listen, I think it's worth saying that the country in general is pretty much fed up with this. Nobody likes FSB. Even most loyal oligarchs from the circle around Putin, everybody nonetheless hates FSB, which instead has wielded the dominant power inside the Russian system. So when I said cracks mean when people will begin questioning this structure of power and this type of policies, I don't think personal sanctions against Patrushev, they are already very strong. More sanctions against Patrushev or Bortnikov will not make any difference. What will make a difference is when the governance system begins to crack, when economy begins to crack, when we see huge growth in unemployment and other mounting problems which these FSB folks cannot manage. So then questions for them and for the effectiveness of their policies will mount in Russia. When it comes out in the open, that will be the beginning of the end, like we had in the 80s. The end of the Soviet system began when people in the general society, in the ruling nomenclatura, had started to openly question the Communist Party policies. So when that happens, FSB will no longer be able to hold on to the status quo with repressions. So again, there is no magic silver key. Like, we introduce some more sanctions against some few yet untouched people from the inner circle, and that is it. No. Pressure on all sides, which will lead to overall questioning of the integrity of the FSB-run system and its policies. Roughly, I think it looks like that.
Thank you, Vladimir. So, take a few questions. Start from the right, please. Yes.
Добрий день, пане Milov. So greetings. We understand that you talked about the end of the war. You elaborated, tried to this. But the question about now. So you said on the phrase that there will be a moment. But now, by all the news on the Telegram channels, there are like thousands of people going out in different cities, Novosibirsk, Moscow, etc. And they are, like, of course, doing something with them by Siloviki. But the question is, where is the leader? Like, well, now you're talking about that people are afraid, have a fear, they're going out, they're speaking. But where is the organization and leader who will consolidate them and say to create one narrative, one voice, which will say all these things which you said now, but in a more constructive way about the action plan. Where is the action plan? Where is the Russian elite, who is the opposition, so-called?
Thank you. I think we got your question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
sorry.
very short. Okay.
Yeah, and the second one.
No.
Just
please,
one?
No, just behind you, please. Thank you. Sorry. But just very short questions. 2 sentences, please.
You told that you see the light for Russia state in the end of the tunnel. But the state is the institutions of government, the establishment of order and security. So how we can talk about Russia as about real state if there is no security, no order, there is even no light in some regions and basic economical goods. Russians are ready to kill and rape others just to get the salary for live not even normal but affordable life. I really believe that there is a light in the end of the tunnel after Georgia, Syria and now Ukraine, because I don't even see the tunnel. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll go for a question here on the left, please.
So after Chechnya, after Georgia, after Ukraine, 2014, and now after Ukraine 2022, you say now is not the time to act. So my question is, when is the time to act? We're on the brink of nuclear war almost, considering Putin's rhetoric, and Russian civil society is still saying that now is not the time to act.
Yeah, I might answer that.
Let's go for those
Where is the
questions.
leader? The leader is in jail. The leader is in jail. And he's been completely cut off even from communications with his attorneys, specifically for that purpose. Because if this leader was free, then he would lead the major anti-war movement in Russia on the Russian soil. This is why he specifically has been put in jail. Ilya Yashin has been put in jail. Volodya Karamurza has been put in jail. Roizman has been put in a de facto house arrest. Are you not aware of that?
No, excuse me, but we cannot go for this kind of...
No,
it's just...
we can try, but listen, the problem is not with the absence of the leader. Anyone can try. You can try. Why are not you trying? It's one thing is go asking Milov this question. When there will be a leader? Another thing is doing this thing yourself. Anyone can try. Many people are trying right now in Russia. Are you not aware where do they end up? So many others are looking at this. Did you see the movie?
Just one name. Who is trying?
No, please. Let's go to the second question. I'm sorry, Vladimir, but we don't have time for...
Well, listen, there are many names, and people are trying. My best advice is that we need to show them some respect and support, not trying to judge what they're doing or not. And also back to the question of when. We already came out many times. Many times. We created the strongest and biggest and most massive opposition movement in Russia in history, bigger than what we saw in 1991. That was a miracle, given the circumstances. That was a miracle that on the face of this reckless brutality, hundreds of thousands of people came out. According to my estimate, the rotating number of participants of pro-Navalny rallies in 2017 to 2021 was several million people. We came up. But the forces are uneven. We don't have arms. We can't even possess them because we will end up in jail immediately. FSB is watching this issue very, very carefully. Possession of arms is forbidden in Russia. Once you try to buy or store arms at home, you get a big jail time, bigger than Navalny. So I mean, people are criticizing us for peaceful protests, but what else can be done against such a reckless machine? We're talking about 400,000 well-equipped National Guard, 100,000 Putin's personal guard. The army which is fighting right now in Ukraine, and when Putin was scared of our peaceful protests, he deployed the army units in big cities. We tried everything. Problem, so it already began. Problem, we have a huge disparity of hard power. This is not solvable easily. This is not a question of absence of a leader or that the tactic is wrong. Like I always say, wrong tactic, go try it yourself. There are many people who say that we need to move on towards more decisive actions. I see a lot of people talking about that. I don't see anyone actually trying to do that. Talking is really something different from action. So we already tried. After Chechnya, in '94, when Yeltsin invaded Chechnya for the first time, I came out at a protest rally. We all were in the streets in protest rallies against invasion of Chechnya, against invasion of Georgia, at the peace marches in 2014 on the streets of Moscow and other cities. So, I mean, this notion that we sort of had done nothing is deeply wrong. And also this issue about, I don't see the tunnel. Well, again, there was a quote from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, what men can do against such reckless hate. Again, when you're out there and you see this absolute dominance in hard power, there are brave people who still go out there and resist. Chances that they will overtake all this, heavily armed FSB and Rosguardia. Slim, to be realistic. Many people are reasonably choosing to wait for a better moment, which I think is the best tactics right now. Some of them, they just can't sit still and they choose to still go out and protest. But you see what happens. Putin is determined for a most brutal mass repression that we haven't seen since 1950s. And, all this poverty, chaos, and all that stuff. We saw that. There were more chaos and more poverty in the late Soviet Union. But we overcame that. We tried to build something which looked like a more modern democratic state. We delivered sustainable economic growth, which significantly enriched Russians, and we tried to move forward towards introducing a European rule of law and institutions and so on. Putin scrapped all that. But we've been through worse times, so the fact that things are bad right now, given all this historical experience, doesn't mean that there is no hope. There is hope. Without hope, we will never achieve any victory against this regime.
Mm-hmm. May I ask you, please, Joe?
Yes, concerning sanctions, I just wanted to know if you think that putting a cap on the prices of oil and maybe also gas, like they're discussing now, could be effective. Thank you.
I couldn't hear your question properly. Can you?
Price cap.
Yeah.
Price cap.
About the price cap.
Yeah.
Okay.
If it's effective or could be effective.
Can I ask the person, yes, behind, please?
This is a very different question, but first of all, thank you for being here and leading this opposition movement. So thank you so much for what you're doing, and especially despite the risks you're incurring. So thank you. For some context, I'm from Washington, D.C., just for a little bit of background there. But in the classes I've been taking there, one of the big discussions is whether or not how much Putin knows in regarding to how much his shoot the messenger style is kind of causing some disruption into how much knowledge he actually knows about the status of the war, as well as our local ex-Russian foreign policy expert Fiona Hill has relayed how exactly how important the nuclear aspect to this is, and whether or not his inner council is nervous about whether or not Putin will actually take measures in that category.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And may I ask you also, please, on the right?
Good evening. So I've been noticing that some of the most vocal opponents to the regime right now are far-right nationalistic politicians in Russia. And I mean, I think we know that these people have been a political force in Russia for as much as you have been. So my question is, how can you be so confident that when the regime cracks, Putin's regime cracks, we're going to go towards something that's better and not different or worse, but not in a good way? How do we make sure that when the regime cracks, we go towards a more peaceful and democratic Russia, not towards a just as belligerent and nationalistic Russia? How do we make sure we move towards the right direction, basically?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question, because I was never aware that far-right populists had any significant popularity in Russia. There was never a case.
So right now, you see on Telegram channels people who are upset because the war is a failure and they want better war. They're upset of Putin because he's not doing a good war. It's not being efficient. In French, you would say they're being plus royaliste que le roi, in a way, which is why I'm asking this question.
Well, maybe I should be careful with analogies. If some people on the street are discussing something, it doesn't mean that it has really strong influence with the public opinion, politics, and so on. You're probably talking about the ultra-imperialist Telegram channels like Girkin and the others. My understanding is that great majority of the readers do not share their views, but only read them to actually, because they're speaking a bit more truth than the state propaganda, they really want to find out about the status of the real status of military situation in Ukraine, because Girkin used to be the so-called Minister of Defense in some of these self-proclaimed republics. I was never aware. Show me one big rally which these people were able to gather.
So within the military itself, there's been, within the military, the army, there's been a lot of critiques regarding the war and how it's been waged by Putin.
We're talking about different things here.
I know, but it's also political.
No, we're talking about different things. There are ultra-imperialist far-right people in Russia. They are very loud, meaning they make a lot of noise. If somebody is making a lot of noise, this is not a proof that they have solid political base of support. My take is that great majority of the Russian population couldn't care less about their very existence. We've never had a situation when far-right populists had won anything significant. The best ever result was by Rodina party in 2003. They got 9%. And I think they got 9% more because there was Glaziev who advocated for socialist policies rather than because of Rogozin, who was the far-right nationalist. I think Glaziev brought far more votes with his social policy ideas than with ultra-right nationalism. So yes, there's this general fear that if Russia is free tomorrow, then ultra-nationalists will take over. Russia was relatively free, according to Freedom House, for 15 years. There was never a sign that far-right ultra-nationalists were in any way popular in the country. You don't, even at present, when this seems to be the dominant ideology in state religion, you don't see many popular bottom-up rallies. Where are the demonstrations in the support of this ideology? When they try to gather them, they get like 1,000 people at the very max, including the rallies where Girkin spoke, Dugin spoke. Just Google Dugin speech at a rally. He does this many times. And look how many people are there in the audience. You sure this is something that majority of Russians would fall for if Russia is free? I am not. Now, moving to other questions, is Putin aware of what is going on? There is a significant problem with information being filtered. But generally, I think the problem is not with the fact that Putin is misinformed as much as with him being convinced that he knows everything himself and has the right worldview. So it's not that he would make a right decision if he's better informed. No, he will make a twisted decision anyway because his worldview is completely twisted. So a lot of strategic mistakes are a result of that, of him, deviating into something which really is at odds with, like Angela Merkel said, he's out of touch with reality. this is
And she said that a number of years ago. I'm sure today she would be a little more direct.
Further, like Voyager 3 to the outer space. As a matter of fact, I think that he's pretty much well informed on the actual numbers, but like with mobilization, he cannot interpret them. For instance, what I understand is for him, the factor of morale of troops, both on the Ukrainian and Russian side, is negligible. He does not take into the account. Big mistake, because this is a decisive factor in the battlefield. Now with nuclear, it's very dangerous that he ramped up this nuclear rhetoric. That's very risky for all of mankind. And after February 24th, I don't think that we can completely exclude any scenarios. So my answer to this is we better get prepared for any possible risks, any possible scenarios. However, if we're speaking about Putin using a nuclear weapon, tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield in Ukraine, problem. It does not give him any military advantage. It's just a big bomb. You don't solve much problems with using it. But first, there will be a much bigger international outcry, including on part of the third countries which have not yet joined sanctions against Russia. And another thing is that any nuclear explosion in Ukraine, at Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or use of a tactical nuclear weapon, will lead to a very significant contamination of Russian regions. Primarily the regions which are supplying most of the Russia's agricultural products. Krasnodar and Rostov are the two biggest agricultural producers. Belgorod and Bryansk, which border Ukraine, are the main meat and dairy product producers. Miratorg is based there, the Russian meat monopoly. Any use of nuclear weapons, like we know from Chernobyl, and this will be of a bigger magnitude, any use of anything nuclear in Ukraine will contaminate half of Russia, and more importantly, the most important agricultural part of Russian territory. So it's like shooting yourself in, I don't know which organ you choose. So I don't think it makes any sense from a practical standpoint. Like if we're talking all-out nuclear war with the West, I advise you to Google in Russian, that's available in Russian, the lecture by Rogozin, «Россия проиграет Америке войну за 6 часов». 9 years ago, in 2013, when Rogozin was a deputy prime minister, he given a lecture saying that the United States will be able to quickly destroy 90% of Russia's strategic potential within hours. So all-out nuclear war means the end of Putin and end of Russia. And our officials are very much aware of that. So this is why, I don't know, Putin might still do crazy things, but if we add just a little bit of rationality, this whole theory of Putin going nuclear just doesn't make any sense from a practical standpoint. On the oil price cap, I'm a strong non-believer in an oil price cap. I think this, I used to regulate prices for 6 years in the government, so I know a little bit of how that works. This is not enforceable. I think this was invented by some theoretical economists who have no idea about enforcement of price caps. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of transactions with maritime shipments of oil, which are very easy to cover behind, some other parties involved, not really shipping Russian crude. Just Google Latvian blend, if you want to understand how Russian oil is mixed with something else. And this is just a very primitive case in front of everybody's eyes. The European Union, unfortunately, does not have any sanctions enforcement agency, which is a problem. We need to fix it. United States has OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control, with 240 employees for enforcement of all the sanctions against North Korea, against Iran, against Cuba, against Russia, 240 people. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of maritime transactions. So, well, let them talk about the price cap. I believe it when I see it. I think the more powerful thing is European oil embargo that is about to come into force a few months down the road. This will really have a serious impact because Russia has nowhere to go. There is not such a big niche, open niche for Russian oil at the Asian market. To deliver oil there is far more costly, and it comes with big discounts. So we will be able to accommodate some volumes there, but not much, and we will lose a lot of money. So embargo is, I think, a far more effective tool, and it's already agreed. It just needs to come into force in December on crude oil, in February on products. Price cap, I'm not so sure how it will even work.
Please.
Thank you for your speech. My question is about the recent news about top executive in energy sector are surprisingly dead, found like in their hotel rooms or somewhere. So it's like a dozen of executives who are perhaps killed, but we never know. So is it a sign of Russian elites being fed up with the regime? And I think the last question was referring to military, like if there would be, if there is a coup d'etat in terms of like military coup, would it be like a military coup or a coup of people who are more liberal, more democratic? So my question is more about that, and I think that her question was about that. And the second part is that, okay, we know that revolution or something like that happens when elites and people are together in hating the present regime. So is, in your to your mind, is current partial mobilization drives anger in people, or they just will continue to be, continue to be supporting, like silently supporting the war?
Three questions.
Anyway, we'll try to answer some of them.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yes, please.
Yes, I have only one question. So Russia, for me, is a state of violence, death, and genocide. And can you give me maybe some argument why Russia should exist as a state if we don't take into account their natural resources?
Thank you. And please, on the left side, please.
You talked about sanctions before and said that we should wait for them to be effective before saying that they are not, and at the same time apply more. So if you take into account the fact that more sanctions will have negative effects on the population, and it can backfire because it can draw more support to Putin, not because they support him, but because they are tired of the negative effects. So should we wait or should we add more?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. This is how Putin tries to explain things, that I'm not to blame because it's all Western sanctions. What we do know from all the previous crises is that at some point people actually stop bothering who is to blame. They want the problem to be fixed, and that is it. Putin has given loads of promises that, sanctions don't matter, they don't bite. We're going to get beyond them, we're going to import substitute, we're going to shift to Asia, and so on. So if you listen to Russian TV, the message is not like, we have to suffer a hardship because we launched a war in Ukraine and the world has imposed sanctions. The message is sanctions don't matter, we'll become even greater. So at some point in time, people would ask a question, you promised to become greater. When will you finally deliver? We've been hearing this for ages. We're tired. We can't buy that anymore. So again, sanctions is not the reason why Russian people are suffering economically. Sanctions are the cure. Sanctions are the instrument to end this as soon as possible. Yes, through some sort of pain. When you undergo surgery, you experience some pain, but it's a necessary surgery. So without sanctions, Russian people, and they began to suffer economically long before sanctions were introduced. Last time we saw economic growth was 15 years ago, before the 2008 market crash. People have forgotten how it happens when real wages and real incomes are going up. And this happened long before sanctions. Now, we will not spare an effort to telling Russian people that, and as time goes by, more and more understand. So that's the way forward. On the deaths or suicides of oil and gas executives, you can throw rotten tomatoes at me right now. I largely do not suspect any foul play here for a couple of reasons. First, most of these folks meant nothing. They had zero influence. Zero influence. Like when I read former vice president of Gazprom Bank shot himself, and everybody goes, top official. Do you know how many former vice presidents of Gazprom Bank are roaming out there? This room will not be enough to accommodate all of them. Former vice president of Gazprom Bank means absolutely nothing. That person has, the very fact that he's former already means that he has zero influence. So I think what happened, these people, they are very rich. They used to live on the edge. They have lots of guns. They are usually heavy drinkers and have a very extravagant lifestyle. And what happened after the beginning of the war and sanctions, they have been essentially cut off from the previous life and the ability to travel freely and enjoy the benefits of the Western world. I think this also contributed to some financial difficulties because they had great exposure to international financial markets. So I rather explain this with a mass psychosis type of events rather than some foul play. There is one exception, which is the vice president of Lukoil, Maganov. I knew him personally. He was a very respected man in the industry, but he was never into politics, never into big money. He was like производственник. And recently, I know for sure, I know a lot of people in Lukoil, he was really very seriously ill. If he was killed, to just throw him out of the window of a central clinical hospital, that's the most complicated way to do it, right? This is really not realistic. I'd rather believe that he was seriously ill and wanted to kill himself. With some addition that, yes, Lukoil top management and owners were really depressed with what is going on. That's no question about that. So, sorry, but I do not, so far, the sequence looks a bit suspicious, but I don't see any foul play in all these deaths. Now, you know, various scenarios of coup d'etat. Let's get very practical about this. Let's stop discussing hypothetical coup d'etat scenarios, because when it happened in '91, it was very real, because 2 months before August '91, in June '91, the future leaders of the coup, Kryuchkov and Pavlov, were speaking at the Supreme Soviet of USSR, demanding extra authority, and tanks were on the streets of Moscow 2 months before the actual coup. So when the coup is coming, you will see it. What we have right now is Putin very, very well protected from any attempts. He has 50,000 strong presidential guard FSO, which is absolutely equipped and specifically trained to protect him. You don't even know where he is at the moment. So, like Gorbachev said in the Kremlin or in Faros, but Putin can be anywhere. Novoogareva, Sochi, Valdai, there are dozens of locations. He has transferred communications, secret government communications, specifically from FSB to his presidential guard FSO. It's called Spetsvязь FSO России. You can't cut him off like Gorbachev was cut off from communications. So when we talk coup d'etat, let's be practical. Who, when, where? Not the abstract military. Military is all in Ukraine. Generals, when they are allowed into Putin's room, they are disarmed 2 miles away from the meeting point and only are allowed into the same room with Putin unarmed. How do you do this? How do you depose an armed Putin guarded by security guards unarmed? That's an open question. So let's be practical. Let's not discuss a hypothetical coup d'etat. Let's be practical in this regard. Does Russia have a right to exist? Listen, I hear a lot of this talk that such brutality and imperialist aggression is something unique to Russia. That sounds a little bit strange to me. I browsed the Wikipedia the other day, and I accidentally ran into an article called Partition of Poland in the 18th century. And I was surprised because I also was influenced by all this talk that there was always, humanity always had one problem, imperialistic, aggressive Russia. So I was surprised to learn that there were two other imperialist countries which participated in partition of Poland. I don't remember the names, but probably, I don't know, Vanuatu, maybe Fiji or Solomon Islands. So, but actually, if we are about to ask questions about the bad stuff that some people did in the past, right? Did they find the energy and the will to actually transform into something decent, normal, respected, playing by the rules and living in peace with neighbors? There are many of these cases. Some, in some cases, 80 years ago, we talked about another European country having no right to exist, and we had a Morgenthau plan, which was luckily never implemented, and so on. So let's not get down to this. Let's look further. Like, remembering what happened 30 years ago, Russia was actually leading the effort to resist the communist coup d'etat and allowing the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin voluntarily signed the Beloversky Treaty, also freely accepting the independence of Ukraine. Sorry.
Excuse me. So, Vladimir, if you know, no, this is just not the place. It's a big lecture hall. Can we?
Invasion in Georgia came almost, quarter of a century later, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
May I propose that we take the last 3 questions, Vladimir? Yeah. Please. Go ahead.
So I wanted to ask whether you think that the most important reason why we don't see any rebellion in Russia right now is really that people are just afraid, because it is really understandable that people don't want to go to prison for 15 years. But I also wonder whether maybe in Russia there is a certain type of disdain for like a liberal democratic international order because of the negative experiences that have been made in the 90s when Russia arguably joined this order and lived by its rules, which has been perceived by humiliation by many Russian people. And I wonder whether you think that this sentiment maybe makes people not want to support this order, since when we, for example, look at Belarus, there have been bigger protests at a time when it was arguably more autocratic than Russia. It being a country that has a smaller population than Moscow, for example, which makes me think about that a little bit, since oppression is not the only metric, I think.
Yes, please, behind you. There's one.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for being here, Vladimir. I have a quick question. It's more of a personal question. I've been wondering what the most powerful states in the world are, looking at G2, G20, whatnot. And one of my questions that came up in my head is, where does Russia stand in all this? Is Russia still one of the most powerful countries in the world? Is it up there with the United States? And it's a big, big question, of course, but I was wondering what your opinion on that was. Is it just is it powerful or just dangerous?
Thank you. And please?
Good evening. I have a super quick question about the Russian society today. So with the mass mobilization order today, we've seen kind of a resistance among the society, with people fleeing the country, and with people actually, well, in super small quantities, but going into the streets protesting the order. Do you think this is more of an anti-war, anti-imperialist movement, or it's still simply an anti-mobilization movement? Thank you.
Listen, I think what is important is that the protest mood that is emerging in the society is kind of all of the above. If you ask people a question why they were sort of positive and supportive of Putin but changed their mind recently, you will see many different forms of answers. Some of the people learned about Russian atrocities and war crimes in Ukraine and were shocked and believed in it and changed their position. Mm-hmm. Some of the people were appalled by economic downturn. Mm-hmm. Some of the people will be appalled by the fact that, I think if you ask me one single question, why the general discontent with Putin, is that he keeps lying all the time. Mm-hmm. How can one believe this guy? Because literally everybody was promised that we will take Kyiv in 3 days, and now he says, no, we're stuck, we're not moving anywhere, so we need to mobilize you personally to go there and solve Putin's problem. So all of this, it doesn't really matter which reason is the most important in people turning against Putin. What matters is more and more people would realize that Putin is a failure. His policies are deeply flawed. It's leading Russia to a catastrophe. And mobilization adds to this, which is good. In terms of its influence on public opinion, for us, that's pretty much positive. More people will be disappointed. Good. This or any other reasons, growing disappointment in Putin is a very good trend. Are Russians inclined to support liberal democracy or not? This is, it's an interesting discussion, but when people engage in this, I think it's really not helpful because you imply that there is some gene inside a Russian ethnic organism that is not compatible with liberal democracy. If you actually study facts on the ground, the facts on the ground are, it's been almost 20 years since Putin abolished direct popular elections of regional governors and local mayors, which is the key pillar of democracy. It was never supported by Russians. Any public opinion survey would tell you that 2/3, 75% of Russians want to elect their governors and mayors directly without any filters. Does that say that Russians are not inclined to liberal democracy? I don't think so. 3 years ago, we had an outburst of extremely important and mass protests in Khabarovsk because they managed finally to defeat incumbent governor and elect their own guy who was popular in the region, and Putin put him in jail. So all of the city of Khabarovsk went onto the streets. They were defending their popularly elected governor. Does that tell about Russians that they're not inclined to liberal democracy? I don't think so. And there are many other merits, many other criteria which say that Russians want freedom, want government accountability, want to have a say, to have an influence on the actual state policies. Does that say that they're not inclined to liberal democracy? Again, I'm not sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of brainwashing in the past years on television about liberal democracy as a concept. Russia is not unique in this regard. Just read all these crazy conspiracy theory websites in Europe, in the United States. They have millions and millions of followers. Does that imply that the residents of the U.S. state of Mississippi are not inclined to liberal democracy because they vote for people who are de facto against it? I'm not so sure. There's been a lot of propaganda efforts had, I think, artificially created a monster out of the liberal democratic idea. Many people bought it. Many people said that, yeah, we have a lot of trouble because of the globalist liberal Democrats are trying to impose their ideology on us. The reality with the Russian experiment, liberal democratic experiment in the 90s have ended up with extreme economic growth unseen in Russian history, which was a direct result of the reforms. Yes, it was chaotic. Yes, it was imperfect. But people wanted a market economy which generates growth. They got it a little bit later than people thought, but they are still nostalgic because they thought, yeah, 20 years ago, everything was growing. But when that happened last time, we forgot. So how about the effectiveness of totalitarian state-dominated model? Not so sure. So it's a battlefield. We need to talk to people and to convince them, and it's possible. We have already achieved a lot in this regard. It was the last question, I forgot which one, if you can remind me. Which I left unanswered.
What was the last question?
Powerful.
Yes, powerful or not powerful.
May we withdraw from that league?
Yes.
May we never ever talk again about Russia's objective being powerful. What about delivering well-being to our citizens? We have all these ages, centuries, millennia, we have been focused on becoming powerful. That came at a great sacrifice for our people and many people around us. Enough with that. Let's not be powerful, let's be good. That's the objective.
That's a wonderful conclusion.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just a few words, particular for the distinguished representatives of the media here. A few of you wanted to interview Vladimir Milov, and his schedule in Paris was packed. But he will be back in October. So please let me know, and then I will connect you with Vladimir Milov for interviews when he's back in Paris. Wishing you a very good evening.